Hello everyone, and welcome to this 8th and final lecture for digital aesthetics, where we'll be talking about augmented and virtual reality. In particular, the plan for today is basically going to break down into 5 sections. We're going to start off by first just characterizing AR and VR, as we'll abbreviate them, just to kind of give us a rough and ready idea of what it is that we're talking about when we're thinking about augmented and virtual reality. This will then lead to a bunch of philosophical questions, and in particular, we're going to look at 3. In section 2, we're going to focus on the question of whether virtual objects, that is, the kinds of things that we might seemingly run into when we're playing around in VR, exist. According to the virtual realist, they do. According to the virtual irrealist, they don't. And what we'll do in this section is look at arguments for and against both of these positions. Then, building off of that, we'll turn in section 3 to look at virtual perception. Here our central question is going to be, are the perceptual experiences we have when we're in VR veridical? That is, do they kind of track the truth in some way? Or are they like hallucinations or illusions, in that they're possibly deceptive or at least not tracking truth? Finally, in the third and final section, fourth section after characterizing AR and VR, we'll look at the question of whether virtual experiences are or can be valuable. That is, in particular, here we're going to look at an argument from Nozick, a famous argument from Nozick, which seems to suggest that virtual experiences could never be as valuable as real-life ones. And we'll think a little bit about this argument and then try and push back against it. Finally, in the end, we'll say a little goodbye, a quick review of stuff we've said, and then toddle off into the sunset. So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and get started with the first section, characterizing AR and VR. So virtual reality is something that's really kind of exploded in use over the last, say, 10 years. This has really been driven by reduction in cost of the equipment needed to play around with. And it's really blossomed to the point where you can now buy some of the reasonably high-end equipment for less than €200. In fact, I think the new HTC Vive 2 is available for €189, and it works great. It's its own unit. The only negative about it is that in order to use it, you have to have a Facebook account, which puts quite a few people off. But so VR has been around for quite a while. Its predominant use, or at least the use that many people think of when you think about VR, is for playing games. This is one of my favorite games. This is Longbow for the HTC Vive. In it, you defend a castle, and you defend your castle from little, in this case, little Vikings. And these little Vikings come in waves, and you shoot them with your, as titled, longbow. Really fun, nice little game. Note, what you do in order to play it is you basically draw the longbow like you were actually drawing a bow and arrow. So your real-life movements then dictate the kinds of movements that happen inside the virtual environment. Where you face with the little viewer is where you're facing inside the virtual environment, and how your hands move in reality then kind of set how the bow and arrow and things move in the virtual environment. Of course, so games is one big application, but games aren't the only application. Another one that can be very useful is for broadly education or modeling purposes. So here is a application called Vroom, originally designed for Oculus Rift. I think it's on several platforms now. It was designed by Mazda. And what you have is one of their engines. I think this is the engine from the M3. And all of the parts have been fully 3D modeled. And in effect, it's meant to be a teaching tool. You can take the engine apart, you can see where all the parts go, get the different labels, put it back together, right? And you can already see it's kind of reasonably well maintained. It tells you where various parts fit and things like this. So really it's kind of highlighting two major applications, it seems to be, for VR. For play, basically turning it into something like a really souped up video game, or for educational or epistemic purposes, where we can virtually engage with things that maybe might be difficult or costly to do so in the real world. And of course, it's not like these two applications are exclusive. You can get silly ones like Surgeon Simulator, where, maybe it's kind of edging onto the game side, but it kind of does a little bit of both. So that's just VR in a nutshell. Now, trying to give some kind of characterization of VR, we can highlight a few things that seem to hold for all of these different uses. The first is that when you're engaging in VR, you're somehow in a computer-generated environment. For example, in the longbow case, you're situated, it feels like, on top of a castle wall. You've got this little forest and hills in front of you. You've got these Vikings coming at you, and you've got your longbow. There's a sense in which you're in this computer-generated environment. And importantly, one of the ways it really works so well is there's a sense of depth and three-dimensionality. In some cases, this is because you can actually physically move around inside a physical space and correspondingly move around in the virtual space. Other times, it's because there's a sense in which things are kind of moving. Again, the longbow case is a good one because you get a sense that the arrow is actually flying out into the world. And because of this sort of environment setting and because of the depth in 3D, VR tends to be highly immersive. My favorite example of this has to do with my mom. She came to visit me when I was still in Glasgow, and my buddy Neil and I took her, and we were playing around with some of these VR settings, and we stood her on the edge of a virtual cliff, and she could hear that we were still in the office. You could hear the traffic outside. She could hear Neil and I talking to her. We told her to take a step forward, and she could not do it. She was shaking like a leaf, because she was so immersed in this virtual environment of standing on this cliff edge that she could not convince herself that she wasn't. She was really caught up in this world, in this virtual environment. Interestingly, so this kind of immersiveness, and immersiveness, exactly what it is an elusive notion. So we'll leave it a little bit vague, but we have a sense of what immersion is. To go along with immersiveness, VR tends to be isolating. That is, it doesn't have to be, and this is radically changing, it tends to be a kind of one-person experience. As it's developing, this is moving away. You get lots of VR chats and shared virtual environments where you have multiple users at the same time, but typical VR tends to still be an isolating experience. That is, it's not shared. It's just one player or one user. And to go along with the immersiveness, the isolation, and moving this kind of feeling of being in another environment, it's disorienting. And it's disorienting in the sense that it tends to make you think in terms of the virtual environment you're in, not the actual physical environment that your body's in as you move around. So for example, if we go back here, you can see you're moving in the living room, drawing the bow, and notably, right, it's disorienting in the sense that it's not helping this person get around in this physical space. It's instead making them think about moving around in this virtual space, in the virtual environment. So in that sense, it's disorienting from reality. And finally, there's at least some people who get this sort of nausea, because, again, there's this sense of depth, three-dimensionality, and movement, so you get this kind of seasickness. So this is kind of typical VR. Again, there's this computer-generated virtual environment. It seems to be fully 3D and fleshed out. It's immersive. It tends to that it doesn't need to be isolating in that there's a single user. And it's disorienting in that it's pushing you in to think about the environment as the place that you are, rather than the physical environment that you're actually moving around in. And it might be nausea-inducing. So that's VR. AR is something, actually, I think many of us have probably run into already. Augmented reality is where what we tend to do is we'll take real reality, the kind of flesh and blood things, we've got all the stuff to kick, and we'll, maybe through a phone or some other device, input virtual objects. So by far and away, the biggest AR application still going, amazingly, is Pokemon Go, where you look through your phone, and as well as seeing the actual space that's on the other side of the camera, you might see various virtual objects for, our little Pokemon here, our Hitmonchan, our Zubat, etc. Um, Similarly, I love this application, it's fun to play around with, is called Place by IKEA. Here you look through your phone and you've got 3D models of various items in the IKEA catalog, and you can move them around in the picture and on your phone, and what it does is it simulates moving the object around in the projected 3D space behind your phone. But so basically it's giving you a virtual version of, in this case, an armchair, and you can move it around seemingly in your room to see what it would look like. So AR is similar to VR, but it's different. And how is it different? Well, so first thing is instead of being in a kind of full computer-generated environment, what it tends to be is that we have computer-generated elements that are in a real environment or in some kind of depiction of the real environment. So the Zubat is it projected onto the thing you're seeing, or the armchair, IKEA armchair, is being kind of virtually displayed inside your room. And notably here, this ties up with the idea that AR tends to be integrated with the real world. And it has to be, right? Just think about the IKEA application. In order for that to work, in order for it to actually kind of give you a sense of what the chair would look like in your room, well, it needs to be thinking about your room, right? It's kind of talking about your room. Again, talking here. It's giving you a depiction of the actual space you're in with this virtual element kind of projected into it. Notably, AR also tends to be partially immersive. It's not going to be completely immersive like VR is, and that's because, well, again, it's going to kind of push you back into the real world. So you might be stuck, looking at your Pokemon Go thing. Right? Famously, when it first came out, you had people walking into traffic or into fountains and stuff, right? But notably, as they're doing it, they're actually moving around in the real world. AR also tends to be, though it does not have to be, a shared experience. And this is tying up with these kind of being partially immersive, is that, hey, I can show you my phone and we can talk about, oh, where will we put the armchair? Like, if we were going to redecorate this room, what do you think? Would this couch go with the wall? Etc., etc. And the last 2 points, well, the last important point is it's orienting. Right? That is, it helps you direct back to the environment. And again, I think the IKEA catalog one is an excellent case here, because in order for this application to work, it needs to get you to think about the real world, in this case, your real room, your real space, and how it would go if there was this additional thing in there. So in that sense, unlike VR, it's helping you re-engage and orient yourself in actual physical space, in meat space, some people say. Um, Unlike VR, which is trying to kind of get you to think about how you're moving around in virtual space. So that's a key difference. And again, you can have cases of AR that are disorienting, but this is kind of roughly characterizing it. The final point is AR, at least as far as I know, doesn't tend to generate any kind of nauseous feelings. Probably because it's only partially immersive and it doesn't necessarily have that kind of you're in a new environmental space that's disorienting from the way you're physically moving. So these gives us a rough and ready characterization of AR and VR. I hope that's something that's kind of familiar to you guys. If we want to give more strict definitions, we can follow Chalmers here, and we can say that virtual reality is an immersive, interactive, computer-generated environment. Now, this is a neutral definition with regards to the ontological questions we'll talk about in the next section. Of course, this only makes sense if we understand what some of the key terms are. So Chalmers says that immersiveness, or being immersive, is generating a perceptual experience of presence, a kind of sense of being there. This maybe ties in with the notion of disorientation, where again you're being drawn into moving around just in this virtual environment. Interaction, we kind of have a grip on this already, but it's that, according to Chalmers, the actions made by the user make a significant difference to what happens in the environment. And note, we want this kind of significant difference point to at least distinguish between maybe something like a 3D movie, where you can do something like change where you're looking, but you can't really impact or modify the environment in any significant way. And finally, it needs to be computer generated. And according to Chalmers, we can just say this is going to be grounded in broadly computational processes. So that's to give us a characterization of VR. Chalmers also gives us a quick characterization of augmented reality, or AR, and he says AR is immersive, interactive, but partly physical and partly computer generated. So this gives us slightly stricter definitions. It's worth noting that this characterization or definition of AR is bad, especially in combination with this one of VR, because in every case, if VR is interactive, it's going to have a user. Users are meat bags, right? That is, they're partially physical. And so all VR is going to also count in virtue of being interactive as augmented reality. That is, every instance of virtual reality is going to be partly physical because of the users and partly computer generated because maybe of everything else. But I think this is something we can massage and work with this definition or these definitions as they go forward. So this gives us our first rough and ready characterizations of VR, right? And AR, we have an idea of what they look like and how they work, and we can use these definitions from Chalmers going forward. So cool. Now, VR, and I'll talk mostly about VR, but everything I say can be sort of spun back to think about VR, throws up a whole lot of philosophical questions. Much like with video games, a bunch of interesting things emerge. So, for one area that's interesting for me are ontological questions. In particular, what's the ontological status of virtual objects? The little Vikings from Longbow, do they exist? Is it right to say things like, I shot the little Viking? And if so, right, does the Viking exist in some way or does it not? So that's an interesting little VR question. Relatedly, there are epistemological questions. So again, there's this kind of perceptual one about like, is my perception of the Viking veridical, or is it maybe kind of like an illusion or a hallucination? Relatedly, and I love this question, if you only ever trained in a VR simulator, would you genuinely have the relevant know-how to, say, fly a plane, or to perform surgery, or to put an engine back together? That is this kind of virtual knowledge, virtual know-how going to segue back and be just as good as real-life know-how? And then it's ethical questions about, well, are virtual experiences as valuable, or can they be as valuable as real-life ones? And maybe on a slightly different track, you might wonder, suppose we had perfectly seamless AR. So, everybody all the time was wearing something like Google Glass, and it was throwing up various little augmented reality elements or possibly supplementing some of the ways that we see the world. Would this and how would this possibly undermine our autonomy? So, for example, you might have really subtle ways this could happen. Say, a particular cereal manufacturer pays the AR people to make their cereal boxes glow just a little bit and to make their competitors' ones just seem ever so slightly duller. And that way it kind of nudges you towards purchasing one particular cereal versus another. Interesting new ways that AR and VR might be able to undermine autonomy. And finally, of course, there's aesthetic questions, right? You might wonder, hey, is AR/VR something like a new kind of self-involving interactive fiction, or is it something else entirely? Are there new kind of aesthetic opportunities or possibilities that VR offers? So what we're going to do in the next few sections is focus on some of these questions. In particular, the next section, we're going to turn to the question about virtual ontology and talk about whether virtual objects exist or not. Take care, and I will see you then.